Hi, this is Bill, and welcome to Progpaganda. In this installment, we're going to continue running down our list of the 25 albums that influenced the rise of progressive rock. We're crossing into 1967 with today's installment. The album we'll be discussing today is the debut album by The Doors, released in January of 1967. In this presentation, I'm going to focus more on the Doors' significance to the progressive rock genre than on their history. But I will say a couple of things about the history and about the album because I think they're important as far as telling the story. First off, the Doors recorded for Elektra Records. Elektra, as I mentioned in our last installment on the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, was a label that was a newcomer to the rock and roll genre in 1966 when they signed the Doors. The Doors had originally been signed by CBS Columbia, but had been dropped due to lack of interest by the label. And one of their friends in Los Angeles, Arthur Lee, who was the leader of the band Love, who recorded for Elektra, made Elektra's head, Jack Holtzman, aware of their availability. Holtzman and his protege, the staff producer Paul Rothchild, went to see the Doors playing on the Sunset Strip in LA and signed them to a contract, which led to the recording sessions for the first album taking place in late 1966. Rothchild did a masterful job of capturing a good portion of the Doors' live show on the first album. And he did so by pretty much recording it in one take where he could, although there are some overdubs. The Doors' instrumentation, as most of you probably know, was somewhat unique. They had no bass player. Keyboardist Ray Manzarek provided the bass through an outboard keyboard bass that he made use of along with his primary instrument, a Vox Continental organ. And for most of the debut album, that is the bass you hear. There are several tracks on the album where that is augmented by an actual bass guitar provided by session musician Larry Knechtel. But in essence, what you hear is what you get on the Doors' debut album, as well as on their second album from the latter half of 1967, Strange Days, which includes most of the rest of the Doors' early stage act. The Doors, in some regards, were almost a prototypical early progressive rock band. They had two terrific musicians in their ranks. Ray Manzarek, the keyboardist, had played with numerous bands prior to the Doors and was very well versed in classics and in jazz, as well as playing rock and roll. Their drummer, John Densmore, was very well influenced by jazz, which comes out in many of the songs on the first album. Break On Through to the Other Side, for example, is very much a bossa nova, which came pretty much directly from the world of jazz in the middle 60s. The Doors' primary songwriters were the other two members of the band, however. Robbie Krieger, their guitar player, was relatively new to the instrument. By most accounts, he had played guitar seriously for less than a year before the Doors' first album was recorded. Considering this and listening to the quality of the solos played on the album's longer tracks, like My Fire and The End in particular, he was a very quick study, and his guitar sound is a very unique one indeed. Then, of course, there's Jim Morrison. Morrison was a combination poet, frustrated filmmaker, and to a certain degree, a frustrated actor. And he brought all of those qualities into his songwriting and into his stage presentation. He wasn't a musician, but he had a good sense of meter, which showed in his poetry and how his poetry could quickly be married to music. His lyrics had a cinematic quality to them. Anyone who has heard even the smallest bit of history about the Doors knows that Jim Morrison and Ray Manzarek studied film at UCLA, and this is very much in evidence in a lot of the Doors' early lyrics. Thinking about, again, the longer tracks, The End, and while it's not on the debut album, the Doors' other long song of the time, When the Music's Over, are very interestingly constructed in that some of the lyrics almost seem disjointed, like they're not really part of the storyline, and yet they fit, and you can't really picture any other lyrics being sung there once you've heard them. It's really rather amazing. Where Morrison may have made his biggest mark on prog rock, though, is in his stage presence and showmanship. He was a consummate stage performer who knew how to engage an audience and suck them into his presentation. It's hard for me to imagine some of the earlier progressive rock frontmen that would become very influential in their own right. People like, for example, Arthur Brown, Alex Harvey, or Peter Gabriel probably would not have approached the stage the same way had Jim Morrison not come before them. So in that regard, the Doors offered a wonderful potpourri of good musicianship, great songwriting, and a great frontman to bring it to the table, which is a great recipe for any rock and roll band, really, but for prog rock in particular, given some of the theatrical elements that bands would tend to incorporate as the genre became more mature in the 1972, 1973 timeframe. I don't think prog happens quite the same way if the Doors hadn't happened first. Well, there you have it. I appreciate your listening. As always, if you like what you've heard, if you have any comments, feel free to click on the subscribe button. Feel free to leave comments. I'll do my best to answer. And we will be back with our next episode within the next few days or so. Frank Zappa, and Absolutely Free, is next. Thanks. You have a good one. Take care.